possessed corpses or the vengeful dead coming back to eat the living, to the modern day pretty, almost heroic vampires of today. The vampire, once a symbol of horror, has in many ways become a symbol of fantasy and wish fulfillment. Historically, vampires represented deep cultural fears: death, disease and the unknown, moral corruption and sexual deviance, invasion or contamination from the other, parasitism and abuse. But in modern times, especially after the 20th century, those fears have shifted. We have medicalized or romanticized many of the threats vampires once symbolized. In that shift, something strange happened. The vampire became cool, rather than horrifying.
And this video aims to discuss this transformation that happened about our views of vampires, how we portray vampires today in comparison to how it was done in the past, centuries ago, when vampires were almost exclusively portrayed as monsters with no redeeming qualities. When we look at the vampire today and its powers, we need to realize that we live in a world where power, control and status are idolized. Vampires, with their immortality, strength, wealth and charm, embody that perfectly. The fact that they prey on others becomes a footnote, even a metaphor, for dominance or success. Modern society has lost the ability in certain ways to see the horror in parasitism, as parasitism has been normalized, because parasitism today is abstracted. The economy has parasitic elements. Social media rewards parasitic attention behaviors. The idea of taking from others to survive or thrive is sometimes even celebrated in our modern culture. So when we look at vampires, we might subconsciously think, aren't we all a little vampiric already? And there is a tragic irony in this. The more we romanticize the vampire, the more we reveal how our own ethics and empathy have shifted. What once horrified us now attracts us. Perhaps because we have grown numb to the real cost of exploitation. And because it is not as clear as it was in the past, when you had more direct examples of exploitation by the upper classes towards the lower classes of society. Also, in a modern society obsessed with autonomy and personal choice and personal power, the idea of someone consensually becoming a vampire is now often portrayed as empowering, a rejection of weakness, aging and even death. But that erases the original horror of the vampire, that vampires are predators who steal life from others and take away the consent from others. And this transformation is also intimately connected to the idea of female sexual agency. In early Gothic literature, female vampires, like Carmilla, embodied women's sexuality as threatening and transgressive. But in the 20th century, that threat transformed into empowerment. The vampire woman became a figure of agency and liberation, choosing lovers, seducing and controlling the world around her rather than being controlled. And this was parallel to and mirrored broader feminist and sexual liberation movements of that time. As the influence from these movements and cultural tendencies intermingled with the portrayals of vampires, creating the modern, liberated, seductive female vampire. Or seductive male vampire too, though that trope is a bit older due to the fact that men and their corrupting behavior on women was a large cultural trope that existed in the 19th century, and arguably even further in the past. But in any case, it is much more common today in the modern time to see seductive, sexualized vampires than it was in the centuries of the past. Which is actually kind of interesting considering that the vampire is a dead corpse, an undead creature that has come back from the dead and no longer lives, and is arguably not what you ought to be sexually attracted to. But vampires being corpses and our lack of fear of this also kind of connects to another aspect that has played a part in the transformation about how we view vampires. And that is our modern alienation from nature and death, from the primal life. In traditional societies, death and life were part of a visible cycle. Parasites and predators were understood in visceral, immediate terms. Today, death is often hidden away, sanitized. Blood is just movie paint. So the horror no longer hits home like it did in the past when we had more contact directly with death. In the pre-industrial world, people feared famines, plagues, natural predation and death. So vampires embodied decay and parasitism. In our modern, more urban, medically secure world, far from nature's threats, those old terrors aren't as immediate. Instead, we fear alienation, desire and power dynamics. Things vampires can embody in more alluring ways, and thus we make vampires more alluring than vampires were in the past. Death and disease and the spreading of it, which the vampire represents and represented in the old, is not as feared as it once was. Death was, as I said before, everywhere in the past. People lived with high child mortality, frequent plagues and short lifespans. Disease was mysterious, and before germ theory, illnesses were explained by spirits, demons or bad airs, and vampires fit right into that framework of explaining diseases. And the concept of a corpse that was moving was terrifying. A body that refused to rest in the grave symbolized contagion, corruption, and a breakdown of social and religious order, something that didn't belong in nature. Something of an evil influence, as plagues risk breaking down society. But in post-industrial modernity, medical advances mean plagues and sudden mass death are a lot less of a daily reality as it was in the past. We still fear illness, but not with the same mythic dread. Death has been pushed out of everyday life. It's hidden away in hospitals, nursing homes, and only presented in sanitized rituals, privately, not in the home or village. That distance makes us less likely to see vampires as raw nightmares of mortality. And we fear different things now. Instead of corpses walking, we fear alienation, meaningless lives, societal collapse, or the loss of individuality. Vampires reimagined today tap into those newer anxieties instead, with the vampire being the rebel or the predatory individual instead, as a symbol of something that is outside of society, alienated from society. And a concept of romance replaces rot. When you don't see disease as an immediate daily threat, the vampire doesn't need to be a rotting corpse spreading plague. It can be an elegant, immortal being with a tragic aura instead. This is partially why we see a shift from the rotting revenant, the peasant vampire digging himself out of the grave, to the seductive aristocrat, the Byronic count that we see with the 19th century and later. The same creature that once embodied plague could now embody allure, longing, and the forbidden. And vampires are also connected to a sort of illusion of control, to a loss of control. In many modern vampire stories, a vampire might tell themselves that I choose who I feed on, I'm in charge, but really, they are ruled by hunger, by a beast inside, where the hunger becomes identity. It's like an addiction with teeth, and people forget that addiction destroys, that in being a vampire is a loss of agency, and the mental gymnastics to justify it are horrifying. The need for blood doesn't care about your morals. It doesn't care if the victim is innocent, or if you have sworn off killing, or if you are trying to love someone. It wants, and eventually you will give in, because if you don't, you wither, frenzy, or worse. Imagine living every moment knowing that your own mind is just one trauma or one whiff of blood away from being like a beast. And this is a forgotten brutality and bestial nature of humanity, of nature, that many modern people struggle with comprehending. And you will see a lot of ancient folklore about vampires being a lot more bestial. And there is a lot of crossover between vampires and werewolves, due to the fact that vampires are predators. They're bestial monsters, especially in older myths, whereas in more modern recountings, they see this thirst of blood less as an animalistic instinct and more like a drug addiction, or something that can be repressed by thought, by will, as instincts repressed by modernity and modern security, will have instead made it more about choice and the powers of a vampire gaining control over their inner beast, due to a lack of personal strength. The bestial nature of a vampire is something that you can control, or you might not be able to control it, but you can at least direct it and struggle with it, at least somewhat, in modern interpretations, rather than something that always has the control, like in earlier vampiric myths, where vampires are basically animalistic monsters, often, with zero self-control or ability to have any sort of semblance of control, or even the illusion thereof. And even the immortality is less immortality in some sort of choice of continuance, and more as a rot of an unnatural permanence. Because consider this, that living forever sounds glamorous until you realize that nothing truly changes except the death of your decay, and you're pretty much a hungry corpse. You still hunger, you still kill to live, and there is no meaning to your existence except living like an animal. And time in this existence loses shape or meaning. The self is eroded for the animalistic hunger. The horror isn't that you die, it is that you keep going long after you should have died. Since your life extension is unnatural, it's against the will of God, the natural order. In an age when many feel disenchanted or rootless, the idea of eternal life, glamorous, powerful, and outside the rules of society, can be intoxicating, and the vampire becomes a fantasy of escape from mortality and mediocrity. Yet, it is the existence of a rotting, animalistic corpse, presented in modern myths more as a choice with a price attached, rather than as an unfortunate existence. An existence that is a blasphemy against the natural order of God. In modern portrayals of vampires, it is a choice with a price attached to it, and with a lot of hardships. But in old myths about vampires, vampirism was more of a curse, of a state that made you damned and often taken over by the devil. Because your continued permanence in this world was not a result of your own active choice to continue, but rather a result of the devil's will, as vampires tended to be heavily linked to ideas about damnation by God's will, and of being corpses possessed by demons, rather than being people still making their own moral choices. And this probably connects to modernity's higher degree of secularism and the idea about personal choice and liberty, deciding your fate, rather than the powers beyond deciding your fate, be it God or the devil. And this is reflected in the portrayal of vampiric immortality as being more of a choice of continuance, rather than as an imposed infernal permanence that is unnatural. And this was helped along by writers like John Polidori, who wrote The Vampire, and later Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, and their later interpretations in movies and such that reshaped the vampire as an aristocratic, seductive figure, and not just rotting corpses. Writers like these transformed the vampire into a being of willful, seductive evil by choice, less animal and more evil human. And this opened the gate to give sympathy for vampires, to give sympathy for the monster, as later modern storytelling that loves complexity and moral ambiguity, instead of pure evil, presented vampires often more as tragic outsiders, cursed beings, or reflections of human flaws. In a way, we turned vampires into mirrors for ourselves, alienated, desiring, conflicted, and with darker impulses, but still ultimately human. Vampires went from evil to alienated. In older folklore, monsters were embodiments of sin, chaos, or divine punishment. They were evil made flesh, something that didn't have anything you could give sympathy for. More of a force of evil nature than anything else. But in modern culture, we often see monsters as misunderstood outsiders, lonely, cursed, or forced into their condition by unjust circumstances. The vampire shifts from demon that must be destroyed to tragic figure we can emphasize with, echoing how we treat otherness in society. And the vampire goes from fear of corruption to exploration of desire. A medieval peasant feared the vampire as a disease-spreading walking corpse. A modern reader or portrayal of a vampire might see the vampire as a metaphor for temptation, intimacy, or forbidden longing. That change shows how monstrosity has moved from physical decay to psychological or social tension, things we can play with rather than only fear. And the monster, the vampire, becomes a mirror. Today we ask, what makes someone a monster? Is it the blood drinking or the cruelty of society? By humanizing vampires, we have turned them into mirrors for our own struggles with power, alienation, and morality. The monster isn't out there anymore. It is inside us. And the vampire becomes a vehicle for safe transgression. Modern culture often uses monsters to stage safe rebellions. Vampires let us explore violence, sexuality, immortality, and power without actually breaking real-world taboos. This ties to why so many vampire stories have a seductive quality. They let us flirt with the danger without crossing the line. But also in this, the monsters becomes beautiful. And in transforming the vampire like this, we have blurred the line between horror and allure. And modern audiences often find vampires beautiful because of their danger and tragedy. They are predators, yes, but predators we secretly wish we could be, or that we wish would notice us. That's a radical inversion. The monster, once a nightmare, is now an object of fascination and even desire. Vampires embody taboo relationships. They are dangerous, alluring, and often outside the bounds of social norms. This resonated especially in times when sexual freedom was expanding. Readers could indulge in fantasies of passion, domination, or submission under the veil of "it's just a story." Vampire stories have often carried queer subtexts. Carmilla, again, is one of the first lesbian-coded characters in Western literature. And as society has become more and more open to LGBTQ themes, vampires have become symbols of both repression and liberation, an allegory for forbidden love and sexuality. When modern audiences embrace the modern vampire, they aren't just romanticizing immortality and tragedy, they are also celebrating a fantasy of sexual freedom, unashamed desire, transgression, and agency. What's really interesting is that no other monster quite carries this same potential of transgression. Zombies are grotesque, werewolves are animalistic, but vampires, because they look human, act human, but transgress human limits, are the perfect vessel for erotic imagination. Though you could argue that this focus upon vampires as sex symbols is basically necrophilia. But I will not go there in further detail. Neither will I discuss vampirism and its connection to various stereotypes and imaginations about foreigners and various ethnic groups, because this is very complicated and I wanted to focus upon other aspects in this video. Yet in any case, the vampire has gone from being a representation of disease or demonic power to a gothic aristocrat in the 19th century to today being a tragic romantic outsider, more connected with empowerment and the power of one's own choice than just being a passive vessel for some sort of infernal power or ravaging disease. Even if those older portrayals still exist in various vampire media, even to this day. And this was my video about how our portrayals of vampires and vampirism have changed and why they potentially have changed as they have changed. And I hope you liked this video. Please post comments and ask questions, and I will respond to you as quickly as possible.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.